Well, hello everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good everything in this beautiful wide world in which we're living, where we just have the ability to connect from across the oceans and
Mhm.
deserts. It's actually quite incredible to think about it. So, welcome back to Aquarius Rising Africa. And I have with me again today Alice Pirola. And I would love to invite Sarah. Sorry, welcome you, Sarah. Sorry about that. Who's a licensed therapist, but Alice, I'm going to ask you to introduce Sarah, who's your guest today. You guys have a lovely connection, so I'd love to hear more about that as well.
Okay, well, I've known Sarah since our Mary Kay Cosmetics days when we were selling Mary Kay together. Sarah, oh my goodness, it seems like another lifetime ago.
That it
And
does.
I know I was in the company for over 20 years. How long were you affiliated, Sarah?
Well, using the product for like 20 years.
Okay,
Selling, I don't remember. It was kind of a brief stint in my career.
because you were part time, so it was different. But we got reconnected, and that's what this show is about today. Is our topic is talking about a really tough thing, which is suicide. And so, Sarah, why don't you tell them a little bit about how you and I reconnected and how that came about, if
All
you
right.
don't mind.
So, well, I guess a few summers back now, I was just in a really, really bad place. And luckily, because Alice had been so open about her mental health journey, that I felt that I could reach out. So, oftentimes, when we are in that very dark place, we're feeling very alone and very trapped and very isolated. And it can feel like nobody understands. But because people have gone before and have shared their truth and have shared their story, it makes it much easier, which is how I then reconnected with Alice. And I was like, hey, I need some help and I just need someone who gets it. So that's how we
I
reconnect.
love, I love what you said there, and I think that's such an important word, but not just the word. The essence that goes along with it is the word truth.
Mm-hmm.
You recognize the truth in Alice. Obviously recognized the truth in you, and
Mhm.
because you had seen someone else deal with their journey and their trauma, I'm going to say trauma, in a truthful way, it gave you the courage to actually reach out and seek help, even if it was just a conversation, even if it was just a phone call. It's so, we talk about suicide and taking your own life. I don't think we realize how often we, just by phoning someone at the right time,
Mm-hmm.
I can't tell you how often my intuition has told me, phone this person or message them or something. And years later, they will tell me that day when you called me in that moment,
Right.
I was in trouble.
Mm-hmm.
Or a very good friend of mine had didn't have money. I did not know that. And she had no electricity, no nothing. And she was sitting in the dark and it was freezing. And normally we'd message, but on this particular day, I said, why do I get the urge to phone you?
Mm-hmm.
And she said to me, and she just started crying. And she just said to me, I've
Aw.
got no electricity. I've got no this. I said, oh my gosh. So immediately I was able to send her some money so that she could sort herself out. And that's what I'm saying, we don't know, even if it's something not as life
Mhm.
threatening as that, but still in a
Mhm.
dark place, right? When someone's there and they feel you, that I think is something so important, which is why these shows for me are so important, because it's about really getting people to feel and understand
Mhm.
that there are others who have experienced very similar things, right?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that was just after I came out with my journey about living with mental health issues and was really open about it. And actually, the environment was quite silent around me. It was quite silent. It wasn't like somebody was wanting to talk about it. So I was kind of surprised when I got Sarah's call, but thank God, thank God. So Sarah, is there anything else you want to add about that, or how your life changed after that, or anything you want to share?
Well, I think for me, like as a therapist, sometimes, unfortunately, I was doing addiction work. So there's still that mentality of us, the professional, versus them, those that are struggling. And it became very dysfunctional in just trying to be like, okay, well, you know, these people that I'm around, they think poorly on those people. So it shouldn't be an us versus them. So being able to remove myself and go, well, I am a them. So it gave me the
That's
opportunity
another very interesting and a huge truth that I've just heard there is like, you know, us thinks poorly of them.
Mm-hmm.
And it is so, so, so true. Not just, I mean, I can imagine if you're a therapist and you're working with people who've got mental conditions, that's quite extreme, right?
Mm-hmm.
But even in everyday life, like Alice was saying with her experience as well, you know, and how many people just shy away from the word mental disorder,
Mm-hmm.
you know, or bipolar or borderline or psychosis or whatever,
Whatever it
anything
was.
like that. It's something you want to like run from,
Mhm.
because as I always say, you know, it's like you don't you know, there's the, you know, people will joke about you don't chop tomato, or you don't go into the kitchen while they're chopping tomatoes with a knife type thing. And that's really not the case, because I mean, but that's the perception that
Right.
people have. And that's really what we're trying to debunk here, isn't it?
Mhm.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And I will say most therapists aren't like that. I just was in a less than ideal work situation, and it was one of those things where it just kept compounding and compounding, and you can't do trauma work
Mm-hmm.
in an unsupportive environment, because you just can't, because you're essentially walking through fire with another person, and you can't walk through fire without getting burned. And if you don't have the supports around it to do it in a healthy manner, then you yourself also get burned to the point where you can have your own PTSD diagnosis, which is what occurred for me.
Wow.
There was a trigger moment for you also, wasn't there? Or
And that trigger moment is still hard. I had a patient commit suicide. He was high, but regardless, he's not with us because of that, and the pressure that was put on me and implied that, you know, I was part of the reason that he did that. Which, as a therapist, I don't have control over anything that anybody else does. I can
no.
provide tools and I can provide guidance. So then it just, like I said, it just kept snowballing for me. And then I was like, well, maybe I am a terrible therapist. I'm already a terrible wife. I'm a terrible mother. Like, what else can be compounded? And then it all spirals out.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that
Were
happens.
you were you working in a mental type facility, or okay, so you were, so it wasn't like you were at an independent practice or something.
Correct. I was working within, here we refer to them as a community mental health agency. So typically for people that don't have the same access to care as someone with insurance or access to a private pay cash doctor, it's more of that community mental health setting. So underpaid and overworked, but still responsible for many things, especially, you know, in this case, keeping people alive. So like I said, it was just an all around bad environment. And of course, it was during a pandemic. So we were essentially told, oh, well, you just have to use self care. And for them, a lot of them, self care meant getting your hair done, getting your nails done, you know, massages. But that's not all that self care is. Self care is being able to set boundaries, it's knowing when to step away, it's knowing that I am not responsible for all of this, and it's okay for me to say no. But oftentimes, helpers in the helping field, that's not something that we get to do. We just take more and more and more until
Absolutely,
there's nothing left to get.
absolutely. I'd be very interested to know a little bit more about the facility, for example, that you work in. Um, what type of cases are you dealing with? Because this must be quite intense. And again, I ask this in the sense of, when we're dealing with patients that are medicated, are you finding that things are going wrong while they're medicated? That sort of stuff. What type of effect does medication especially in these confined environments have? Because I hear horror stories about that, I have to say.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think it just kind of depends. For perspective, I've been doing substance use and addiction treatment since 2008. Let's not think about how long that actually is. Here in the United States, I'm not sure exactly how it is in South Africa, we have this problem with Oxycontin and the opiate epidemic. So
Oh, yeah.
we have a huge problem with it. So for the bulk of my career, I did substance use treatment within the confines of the child welfare system. So typically a person only made it to me if their child had been removed from their care. So the whole goal of our treatment orientation was to be able to get the family to a place in which they could be safely reunified for those children to come home. So now you see there's a whole extra layer of pressure. I'm not now just responsible for one person. I'm now responsible for this child coming home. And oftentimes it was our determination of who gets reunified and who doesn't, because we were the expert witnesses in court sometimes. So there's just like an extra layer of it. Here where I live is an area where at one point we had the highest overdose rate in the state of Florida. So most of my clients at that point, they were using opiates and IV opiates, and here we mix it with meth, and it's just a disaster most days. But I think what needs to be portrayed here is that addiction is not a moral failing. It is not because they couldn't, just stop to, take care of their children or take care of their families. All of these patients love their children dearly. They just suffered from a disease of the brain, and they didn't necessarily have the tools to cope with it. So a lot of the medications that we used in that aspect was the opiate blockers and medications that help reduce cravings to use, so that they could get a little more footing under them about how to just cope in daily life without getting high. So that's a lot of what I did. And then for the last year or so, I was doing, here in Florida, we call it a Baker Act assessment. So it's that 2-hour psychiatric, involuntary psychiatric evaluation for, a hospital stay. So I was doing those primarily on students in a local high school district. So assessing students for suicide and helping place them into treatment in more of a crisis responder type situation. So I've always kind of done high need, very intense work. And like I said, if you don't have the skills for yourself to be able to take care of yourself, it can compound the problem even further, because now we have traumatized providers. So yes. Now, I'm not saying don't tell your therapist like your traumatic stories. That's not what I'm saying. Like, that's what we're here for. It's just we have to take care of ourselves too, and that's our responsibility. So please stay open with your therapist and tell them everything. That's what they're for.
One of the things you said, Sara, that really struck me when you were talking about self-care. Part of self-care is reaching out. And if you don't reach out, if you isolate, that's where you start that spiral down, and it's just like a black hole that you can't get out of. And a lot of times, especially as a therapist, I have to commend you, because a lot of times we're so embarrassed to talk about it, and it's suffocating. And a lot of times our family doesn't even understand. People think that suicide is selfish. It is not a selfish act per se. It is a hopeless act. It is something that is conjured up because you feel so unworthy. You feel so just like, if I live here one more day, then I'm making life horrible for everybody else around me.
Correct.
And I am a burden to everybody. I am not pulling my end of it, and all I do is cry, or I'm in depression, or I can't get out of bed. And so when people think that suicide, how could you be so selfish to do that to your family? I want people to understand that it is not a selfish act. We don't see it like that. I have suffered with suicidal ideation my actual entire life. And the attempts that I've had where I have tried to move forward with it, thank God it didn't work. It was never, it was just, you're so consumed with that feeling. Sara, am I making any sense here?
Nope, you're making sense. And that's kind of what it is, because people always go, like, let's use some big celebrities, for example. We have, Robin Williams and Kate Spade and Chris Cornell and Chester Benningfield from Linkin Park. Like, they had access, they had money, they had treatment options, they had everything.
Right.
Yet they still died by suicide. And so that's one of the big things I think we still need to change our language is committed needs to be taken out of there, because they died from depression, they died from PTSD, they died from bipolar, they died from addiction. They did not
bingo, that's it.
Crime, they did not commit something inherently wrong. And I know I came from like a conservative background, and some of those things is suicide is a sin, and we don't take ourselves out. That's God's decision. But now I also have come further, to just understand, like, they don't want that. I can tell you, when I have been at the lowest, I would not wish that feeling on my worst enemy. I would not wish it on anybody. So no. And then, like you said, like, you don't reach out, and social media probably has made everything 10 times worse. We already know that. We see what happens to the kids, but I know I would see, oh, wow, look at this beautiful party they planned, or the dinner, or this or that, or their kids are so well behaved, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then it kind of pulls you further and further, because you're like, well, I'm the opposite of that. Clearly, I am failing at something over here, because how come they can do it that I can't? So then it turns into, well, I'm lazy, or I'm useless. I am this, that, the other. And then, like you said, it turns into that, well, I think everyone would be better off without me, because all I'm doing is making it worse.
Right.
Sometimes we get stuck in that. And one of the things I have historically taught my clients is the hardest thing you will ever do in life is ask for help. So even me, I'm falling further and further. And then all of a sudden I'm like, okay, well, what would I tell a client? I'd be like, well, you need to do this and this and this.
Right.
And just reaching out and being vulnerable. So I think Brené Brown does a lot of work on vulnerability and healing, and just by telling your story and telling your truth, because we can't heal without that opportunity. So
Absolutely.
Yeah. And when you're self-medicating, you're already letting your inhibitions down, whether it's alcohol, drugs, whatever it is, it doesn't matter what it is. So if you're feeling those inclinations and then you're self-medicating on top of it, you've lowered your inhibition. So you're just saying, this is so easy, I could just get out of here and not have to feel this pain. The pain physically hurts of depression, the pain of having borderline personality disorder, and the emotions that roll over us, and the things that we feel and the things that we go through. It is a physical pain. People don't understand that. They think it's just mental, whatever. Your whole body is consumed when you are suffering through a severe depressive episode, PTSD. Your whole body, it's mind and body and soul. It's all connected. So, I mean, do you feel that's true, Sara, as a therapist?
Very, very much so. It's all mind, body, spirit, the whole thing. And you can't have healing if you're kind of lacking in one of the areas. Like, the goal here, though, is always progress. It's not perfection. There is no perfect healing. There's no perfect way to do it. What works for you might not work for me. So it's a different, very individualized, like, I mean, there's no magic wand. There's no quick fix. Like, it's knowing that sometimes it's going to hurt even more before it gets better. When I tell people who are healing from trauma, I usually, do this little mannerism here. I'm like, picture the worst festering, bubbling wound that you could ever imagine. You have this itty bitty Band-Aid on trying to keep it together. Now, in the act of getting sober is typically how I said it. You've now removed this Band-Aid. This wound is still doing all sorts of funky things here. and your option is either to clean the wound or lose the limb. So but we picture it with physical things all the time. We go, oh, we have to debride this, we have to clean it, we have to this, which is the same theory of what we're doing with trauma treatment is we're cleaning the wound, and it often gets much worse before it gets
much worse.
Much worse. Sorry, I'm not gonna lie to you.
What's your take on, on the topic of like neuroplasticity when we're looking at that? Basically the life events will cause changes in the brain, literally.
Yes.
So obviously, if someone has been traumatized a lot, I can well imagine that the shape, not just the brain, but literally the cells within the body as well, everything is distorted because you're not a truer version, or you're not the true version of yourself, right? So, but then I'm going to say that if trauma split that or cracked that, you see, because I don't believe we are ever broken. To me, the word healing means just to bring yourself back into balance. So it's about rebalancing the spirit.
Yes.
Because I disagree with people when you say the spirit is wounded. It's impossible for the spirit to be wounded because that is God. But the mind is wounded because spirit splits off and becomes body and mind, basically. You are not your mind and you are not your body in the way that you are currently sitting. And, when we get closer to and align with that true spiritual, with God's desire for you, and which is your desire for you ultimately. God wants for us what we want for us, right? So when we are in that place, and this is just a thought now as I'm listening, surely the brain would then have the capacity to reconstruct itself, because that's God's promise. And I know this I've healed myself from breast cancer with nothing. So I do know that the body is designed to heal itself. So I'm just sitting here with this feeling that if external sources, like in Alice, your particular situation, especially when you were anybody teeny tot, had the ability to affect you in that way, then there must be a way that everything reconnects again.
Sara, I'll let you take that one.
Well, that's the concept of resiliency. So I'm picturing it in children when they have that high adverse childhood experiences score. So that's the ACEs trauma score. And it's 10 questions about things that happened to you prior to the age of 18. Well, they are seeing, the higher the score, the more risks of addiction, mental health issues, high blood pressure, diabetes, high cholesterol, like all sorts of physical problems too. There's a really good TED talk on that. All of a sudden, I can't remember her name. Nadine Harris. It flew out my brain for a second, as my kid would say. It just flew out. She has an excellent TED talk on how the adverse childhood experiences can affect you throughout the lifespan. But the cool thing, we'll use kids, for example, is they have an amazing amount of resiliency. And that's, I think, what you're getting at there is that ability that we ourselves have to do the healing. And the neuroplasticity, like, for example, like math, if you don't use it, you lose it. So same concept here, like you have to use the tools for them to actually work. So to be able to refocus your brain and retrain your thought patterns, that's that cognitive behavioral therapy. We got to focus on what the feeling is, what the thought is that goes with it, and be able to argue with our brain. So that's where that neuroplasticity comes from. There's lots of the PET scans and the MRI scans, and you can see this is a brain of like a heavy drug user. This is the brain of someone who's never used any. And there's some that have depression and PTSD as well. So you can see the neurons differently in what is considered a I don't want to use the word normal. I really don't think there's any truly normal brains that exist at this point. I think we all have some kind of quirk or some.
Well, yeah, I think, you know, we should refer to it as a healthy brain.
A healthy brain,
so,
yeah.
you know, so whatever your term of healthy is, I guess is also up, you know, is up for grabs, really. But yeah, I do think, you know, because once, you know, for me, when we align with spirit, when we align back with God and God's divine grace, the body's designed to heal itself. And this, for me, is what I think. And as healers, I think we're going to be seeing more and more and more of these cases. In fact, as healers and doctors or whatever it is, psychiatrists, although I must say the average registered, well, psychologist, psychiatrist, to me, a lot of that is questionable. And I don't disregard it, so I don't want to be rude about it. But I talk about the true healer, you know, the person that has been through the experience, the person that has come out of the experience, the person that has grown through the experience, the person has understood the healing. And, you know, so that for me, and more as we go on, we're going to see more and more people coming out of SRA, more and more people coming out of traumatized childhoods where literally the abuse has been off the charts. So I think more and more we're going to be seeing these situations, right, where there's definitely the brain has been affected by the actions of others and traumatizing kids. And even adults, you know, I mean, you know, when someone has gone through severe shock or severe grief, I mean, their hair goes gray overnight. I've literally seen that. You know, when someone has lost a partner unexpectedly or something like that, literally they go gray overnight.
One of the things, Chantelle, as you're talking, one of the things is when our daughter was in Christian school, she was in a controlled environment. It was supposedly a clean environment. Everything was really parent oriented, etc. And we took her out and put her in public school for high school. And when I used to drop her off in the morning, I used to feel like I was taking my daughter and putting her in a dirty toilet water environment. And one of the things that it might be contrary to what you're saying is whether or not the person can get out of the situation that they're in. If they can change their mindset enough that they can get out of whether it's domestic abuse, whether it's incest, whether it depends on what it is. What is harming the mind at that moment? And, you know, I would leave the school crying, knowing that my daughter was going to be immersed into this culture that she really had no idea about. Now, she actually excelled and did phenomenally well and, you know, came through it very resiliently. But the thing I'm saying is, if that person is not taken out of the situation, that's why it's so important to have the therapy, to have the dialectical cognitive therapy, and to go through the processes. Because if you don't, you're staying with that mindset. Does that resonate with you, Sara?
Yeah, that does. And all of a sudden it flew out my brain again. Look at that. So a lot of it is coping skills. And when I drop my kid off at school, oftentimes I remind myself, this sounds terrible, is I'm not putting my child in a war zone. My child is 8. For perspective, every time I send her off into that school, I also, you know, because unfortunately my traumatized brain has seen the worst of humanity. It has seen and heard the worst of the worst. So I have to often remind myself, just because it happened to someone else doesn't mean it's not necessarily going to happen to your kid. I have to take a step back. But like, I remind myself that these kids they're fighting their own battle on a daily basis. The kids today, they are their own breed. I don't know. It's just what it is. And if you don't,
you know the coping skills, you know how to cope with that. And then there's the parent that doesn't.
Correct.
You know what I'm saying? And so that's where what you're saying, Chantelle, makes a whole bunch of sense. Yes, it can come back, and it did for me and our family. Thank God. That's our testimony. That's our testimony. That's why Sara called me. And because, you know, I was able to give that testimony. If I were still wallowing around in that and in that mindset, there's no reason for her to pick up the phone and call me. It's two drowning people together going down. Does that make sense? Yeah.
That makes sense. But if you hadn't had been opened about it, I wouldn't have known that there's a safe place, because there were a bunch of people, like I could see what they posted and I'm like, nope, not reaching out to them. Or I could see other people and I go, okay, they're safe. I can message them.
Oh,
and
my heart.
And I know a lot of it, I started paying attention, was how people responded to Meghan Markle when she reported that she had postpartum disorder or postpartum depression. A lot of people, they kind of stuffed it aside, and I was like, okay, I see that they don't get it. It's not that they don't want to get it. They don't get it, because, well, how could anyone feel that way? They're pregnant. How could anybody, you know, what do you mean they're so depressed they don't want to live and they're suicidal? Well, what do you mean? They have access to everything. Again, that's that same concept. Right. She had access to things, but didn't feel comfortable reaching out. So then you come into this whole, you know, different dynamics of it. Is there's pressure to maintain that perfect image and pressure to just
exactly
be what everyone else wants you to be, and not that wounded side of the person, like where your spirit is broken. So that's where I get that it's like that broken spirit, and you know, it's up to us to be able to kind of get back to our balance, like you said, and get back to where we are and back to like what our actual truth is.
Yeah, I understand absolutely, Alice. Obviously, people, while they're in the situation and there's abuse and they've got no control, it's virtually impossible, you know, when you are in that mindset. But I'm more speaking about afterwards, when people have realized, okay, you know, they've like yourself and so many others who said, okay, hang on, I need to realize that this and this and this probably puts me in a category of that and that and that. Now, how did I get there? Let me look at this. How can I balance? You know what I'm saying? So they get to that place. And I think it's such a multifaceted healing is never on one dimension. You know, I always talk about healing, you know, the human being like the table with the four legs. So when we look at a table, we have to understand we are spirit, right? So the first leg is spirit. The second leg is emotion. We have to realize that we are emotion as well. We have to realize that we are mental, cognitive, intellectual energy as well. And we are physical. So there's four legs. And if one of those legs is not balanced, your table is going to wobble. And we all know how irritating that is. So it's up to us to take 25% spirit, 25% emotion, 25% mental, and 25% physical. So we then have to find where something is lacking within us. Where is this leg so much shorter than those that I can't, you know, that I'm wobbling, whatever, you know? So, and usually what we're going to find, and what I found a lot in my 20 years of working with people, is that the first thing that they miss is spirit. And when I talk about spirit, usually the most religious people miss the spiritual leg completely, because they are so indoctrinated. They've got such a warped idea about who their creator or who God is, that immediately everything is based on fear. When everything is based on fear, that you've got to do this, otherwise that's going to happen. If you're not that, everything is based on conditionality, right? So when we realize that our energy, that what we are creating, just on a subconscious, unconscious level, is coming from fear, how can our emotions be secure? How do we feel strong and trust our intuition? We can't. How do we think cognitively and rationally then? And how do we have a good physical experience when all of this invisible stuff is fighting with each other inside of ourselves. Because all three of those imbalances are going to be manifested in the physical, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because the physical body, the body keeps the score.
Body keeps the score.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So for me, it's really about taking a step back and saying, right, do I feel strong in my spiritual belief?
Mm-hmm.
Is it someone else's belief or is it mine? What makes me feel comfortable? Let me sit and pray right now and just see how that feels if I've never done it before. You know, let me read something or listen to a podcast or something that's going to ignite that flame, because spirit is fire. It's a flame that we ignite. It's like striking that match and go, whoa, suddenly there's life in me. It's
And
like that.
and you can see that life come up in a person. You can physically see it. You know.
Yes, it's like the sun rising.
Yes.
It's like the sun rising after a cold night.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, the emotions, which are obviously the invisible, and that's where us ladies get caught up all the time. We are so fearful around not feeling positive or enough, right? So we constantly second guessing ourselves. And then the emotions and the thoughts are working together. So when you're feeling emotionally out of sync, your thoughts are going to be out of sync because they talk to each other, right? And when your thoughts are out of sync, your emotions are going to be out of sync. So it's two warring parties fighting with each other, deciding what's the best course of action to take. My heart says this, my head says that. Rip, rip, rip. So we end up feeling so torn. And then the poor body has to now try and hold all of this in. And that's when we injure our body, right? Very often that's where injuries and illnesses and stuff are coming from. You look at stress. Stress is the biggest killer out of every disease. You look at every disease, it's coming from stress. Every disease comes from stress.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So it really is, you know, for me, it's about people. Sorry, Alice. It's about people just putting down all the bullshit they've heard other people say and just saying, what works for me, God? What works for me? And, you know, I just think when we have that relationship with God on that level, that you know, 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 it's already done. I am healed. That's Jesus healing. In the modern day world, we don't need the man anymore to come and put his hand on our head. We just really have to believe that Jesus works in our lives all the time. And if we are open and ready for healing, we're going to receive it.
It's the indoctrination of some religions that are so, I'll use the word cult-like. You know, they will absolutely suffocate you if they can, you know, and to get out of that. Sarah, you experienced that. I've experienced that. And, you know, to get rid of that pain and agony of relying on man to show you what God is about. We can't rely on man to show us what God is about. We have to have our journey with Christ. We have to have our own personal experience, and that's where that comes from. You know, some other things that a mental health component will have is you will self-harm. And if you get into self-harming, which can be anything that breaks the subcutaneous skin, does that kind of sum it up?
There's actually many different ways to do it, but yes.
Yeah, there's many ways to do it, but yes.
The long term for it is that non-injurious suicidal behavior, which is not always true because sometimes there are significant injuries that come, but it's from what you had mentioned earlier about that deep emotional pain, and you can't get it out. But if you cut or burn or ingest something or basically kind of self-mutilation, so to speak, like you then have that physical pain to focus on. It's now removed from the body, and that you you release that pain. So like, I think having worked with the teens for a bit, because a lot of people, they're not even comfortable asking those questions, or they go, well, I just don't understand how someone can do that to themselves. And I go, easy.
In the pain.
Yeah. I self-harmed for years and years and years. And it's really, you just feel so void and dead inside that it literally, when you break the skin or when something happens that, you see the blood, and I'm not trying to be gross, I'm just being real, the endorphins rush to that place, and all of the feel good rushes to that place, because that's where you're going to feel alive again. And it's very addictive. It's very hard when you're going through a very intense time, and people don't understand it. You can't talk. That's why, Sarah, you said, who's safe to talk to? I didn't really have anybody to talk to. I was going through it. My husband was watching me suffer, and my family sure as heck didn't understand it, and I would call my sibling, my brother, crying my eyes out, saying I wanted off this earth, I wanted off this planet, whatever the case was. And he didn't know what to do with it. And the first thing you do is you say, no, you don't, no, you don't, no, you don't, So, or you try to shut them down. You try to shut the person down. Well, why could you think that way? Think of everything you have to live for. Think of everything you have. You have, a beautiful daughter, a beautiful marriage, this, that, and the other thing. And a lot of it is so much the facade that we put up for other people. And, that mask that we wear. So, Shanti, everything you're saying is spot on. It's just when you're in the throes of it, when you're in the middle of it.
Totally. I get it.
Hard. It's so hard to see it. And there will be times that I feel like depression sometimes is like drowning in an ocean. And you come up and you're gasping for air, and you're like, I can see my life. I can see my life. Oh, no, you can't. And you're back down again. And, then you come up and then you go down. And so it's really hard if you don't have those grounding techniques that I've learned through therapy, years and years of therapy, and just years and years of self-searching, working with my Christianity, working with my relationship with Jesus Christ. All of that just brought me to a new level. We have to rise up a level. And what's the word I'm thinking of, Shanti? It's frequency or whatever it is, we have to increase that level of frequency.
Expand.
Yes.
Like the sun rising, when the sun shines, when the sun comes up in the morning, it's first like a peekaboo, and then it... that feeling. So the sun is inside.
We have to notice it in other people, though. It's like we have to see it in their eyes, right?
But what is really good, and what I often find works incredibly well, is when someone is in a bad place. Let's say they're either in depression or they're freaking out because the bank is foreclosing on them, or it could be any reason, right? Really, just to, if you have an animal, spend time with your animal. Just laugh, go for a walk, stroke the cat. Anything to give you relief from that heavy situation. Anything. It doesn't have to be the situation fixing itself. The situation is not going to fix itself while it feels that heavy. So what we need to do is then find ways and little things that are going to make us feel better. So take the dog for a walk around the block. Laugh with stroke your cat. Call your friend and have a chuckle for 5 minutes. Watch funny kitty videos on YouTube for half an hour. Get something going, because you see, the minute you get that energy going, you raise your frequency. That's how you raise your frequency. Then suddenly, an hour or later, you look back there, doesn't feel half as bad anymore. And suddenly, plop, a solution has popped in the meantime, or an opportunity has popped in. That's what I'm saying. We can't fix the problem. We can't fix our pain by feeling pain with the pain. And by resisting that pain. We cannot resist what is. And this is why this is so beautiful, because we have to acknowledge that we're in trouble. We have to acknowledge that we need help. We have to acknowledge that having violent outbursts 3 times a week for no rhyme or reason is not really normal, right?
Amen.
So then you would say, okay, I feel anxious most of the time. I feel angry most of the time. I'm enraged with jealousy most of the time. Let me see what that could be about. Google, blah, 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 blah. Start reading up on stuff. Maybe go, if you're not into pharmaceutical stuff, go to the health shop and see if there's some herbal remedies that can start. Just that acknowledgement is already an acknowledgement for healing. It's a cry for help. It's an acknowledgement that you need help. You don't have to be sitting in the therapist chair for 6 months. In fact, I highly don't recommend that as much as what you can. You know, honestly, there are brilliant healers out there at the moment. Contact a brilliant healer who understands your situation, right? Someone who's been through it. And then that person can take you on a journey of personal experience, and not something you learned in some university and are battling with yourself. Most psychiatrists are highly depressed themselves. Now, why would I want a highly depressed person to administer concoctions to me? That's what I'm saying. You want to go with someone who is walking the path. That does not mean the person is healed or perfect or has no flaws. None of us would have clients or students. You know, you teach the thing you need to learn the most. I should be freaking teleporting by now. And I'm still sitting here.
So how do you find, how do you get your clients from point A to point B when they're in such a low place?
Depends on the client. And some of it is just finding, like, sometimes I just throw everything out at the wall and I'm like, here, these are all the suggestions. These are all the tricks, the tips. Like, now it's time to experiment. And that's what it is. Therapy is not really a science. Well, it's a science and an art. And that's where a lot of people
art. Like, I love the word art.
It should work. This should work. This formula should work. It doesn't.
It's an art.
What do you feel about the concept, Sara, of revisiting the past experience, revisiting your childhood over and over and over again, and just going every week to sessions and just talking about, oh, when I was 5, I was dropped on my head, you know, or whatever the case was. What do you feel about rehashing the past over and over again?
I mean, I'm not a big fan of that. Okay. However, sometimes to get people through to the other side, they need someone that's going to listen to that for maybe the first time ever in their life. So there's a point to, narrative therapy and trauma work. However, there's also that whole point on the other side is, okay, yes, it's really shitty that all of that happened to you, but how are we going to get through? So it's about the resiliency. It's about the coping skills. It's about that. Like, if perhaps you're seeing a therapist and all they want you to do is relive that trauma, they might not be the one for you, because you're sitting here going, well, yeah, I know that all these bad things happened to me, but how do I get through? And so some of that is how, like, for my clients that we would be working on their goal of reunification or their goal of sobriety, oftentimes I'd be like, you know what, this is a limited time between you and I here. I was like, because my ultimate goal is to free you from the nest so that you fly. Like, if you feel that you have to like stay stuck in this pattern, like you need the skills that you're going to be flying. Now, for me, the rest of my life, therapists need therapists too. So that's how we hone our skill to make sure we're taking care of ourselves so that we can take care of our patients. So there are scenarios where, you know, long-term, lifelong therapy is something that someone has to do. However, typically, like at this point in my journey, it's going, okay, well, I worked on this, and this, but I still want to do better at that. And now, you know, what are some things that you continue to learn about yourself and learning? Like, it provides you a safe environment to say the things that you want to say in maybe the real world that you haven't gotten the chance to say yet. And it allows you to practice some boundaries and be able to say, nope, I'm not going there today. This is not what I need. This is not what my mind, my body, and my spirit needs. Like, and allowing you to be more comfortable to tell people no. No in itself is a complete sentence. N-O, no. But it's not, no, but I want to do this.
Yes.
This. Like, no. Yeah. All you have to do is say no.
And I so agree with you. I so agree with you on your point there about, you know, rehashing. And I want to tell you, I would have people come to see me in the past where they've been with traditional therapists for 15 years. And I'm going, what? And you haven't moved for that very reason. Because, you know, everything in life is energy, sound, frequency, vibration, bam, we understand that. So think about this. How does energy work? The more attention you give something, the stronger and fatter it's going to be. The more you exercise those muscles every day, the more pumped they're going to become, right? So the more you talk about your trauma and the more you go there and you relive it, the more trauma you create within your energy because you're keeping it alive. It's like a suffering animal that should be put out of its misery in the best possible way, right?
Yeah.
So, and I agree, there has to be an acknowledgement but you know, Sarah, and I'm sure you will know this as well, you know when a client comes to you or someone comes to you and they've literally only exposing the story now, or they've spoken about it only once or twice. You know that person when they're really saying, I need to deal with this, or the whiner. You know, right? There's a big difference, right? So the point is, yes, everyone needs to be heard. Even the whiner needs to be heard. And I say that without judgment. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be critical to anyone. But, and so I agree. You acknowledge, and that person has to acknowledge. But what really works is that it's like when my fiance was killed in a hijacking. It was such a traumatic experience for me. But I knew that was the catalyst for something incredible to happen in my life. And had it not been for that, I would not be doing the work I do today. So in that moment where I was IDing his body at the mortuary and the trauma, his voice came to me in that moment and said, I'm right here. That's just my body. I'm right here. And in that moment, I started working with his death, with his energy, with his spirit. And it didn't mean he's now inhabiting my body or anything. So please, anyone, don't get any weird ideas. It's just that, you know, when you're so connected to God and to full consciousness, all of us around us, when someone leaves their body, it doesn't mean they're not around anymore. They certainly are. Their spirit lives on, okay? And of course, that's, for me, that was something I felt very strongly. And for me, that was something that gave me the insight to do what I'm doing today. So any trauma is an opportunity for something very beautiful to occur. And if we allow ourselves to see that, we're going to see the gift. And that's where, you know, when I say it's spiritual alchemy, You turn that lead, the lead being the pain, the suffering, the dark night of the soul. In a moment when you understand it, it's like a flash of gold, and it becomes gold. So now suddenly you can work with the experience as opposed to have it destroy you or crush you or limit you or be this massive obstacle for the rest of your life. So it's really how we choose, when we have been through these traumas. Most people I've worked with who've been very traumatized and have come out of situations have gone on to be the most brilliant healers. I'll tell you that much. There's a reason why we go through these things. There's a reason.
Yeah, if you allow yourself that growth. Yeah.
Well, they call it post-traumatic growth, because you've now come through to the other side and you're able to see, I was able to rebuild my life. I was able to make these changes. Like, it's okay. That happened to me, but I'm okay. I'm okay. I'm okay. Many times you don't feel okay. So you just have to go, I am here. I'm connected. The grounding techniques. And I will say, because you guys touched on spirituality a lot. So say someone's listening and they're not quite there yet. That's okay too. You just have to be able to identify that there's something bigger than me outside of my body. It doesn't necessarily have to be it in NA and AA and Narcotics Anonymous, Alcohol Anonymous. They call it the God of your understanding, or the higher power of your understanding. So it doesn't have to necessarily be the Christian God or any of the specific entities. You just have to be like, okay, I'm connected with something outside of my body. That's really all it is. And one of the most things that stuck out for me is a long time ago, there was a patient. He's like, they told me to go to the meetings and they told me to listen and they told me to find this God. Well, I don't believe in God. So eventually, the patient said, I looked at the ashtray on the table and I was like, well, I believe that ashtray there holds ashes. So I can believe that outside of my body does something. So then it got bigger and bigger and bigger until they eventually were like, oh, hey, this is the God of my understanding, whatever that may be for those people. But you have to be able to get out of yourself for a second to do that. I'm not saying that this is easy. In my own journey, I spent a lot of time angry towards my higher power and angry about, well, I've done everything that certain religions tell me that I should have done. I see a hashtag often that drives me nuts. It says too blessed to be depressed. And I'm like, this is not how this I can have everything and still suffer from, a chemical brain imbalance or whatever we want to say it. Like, I can have a house, I can have a kid, I can have a job, I can have all of these things that are blessing, but I can still be in the pit of despair with, what perceived to me was no way out. So
thank you, Sara.
That's so true. And often that pit you talk about would oftentimes be blocked away childhood experiences or something like that.
It could be just about anything.
Yes. And that is so important. And sorry, I just want to say that is so important if people can recognize that within themselves. On the surface, it looks like you have everything, right? And I think, and also people I've worked with over the years, especially mothers, women who are mothers and obviously still in the process of raising their kids, they feel like they've got this beautiful home and successful husband and 2 kids and a car and freedom to spend what they want. But there is something that they just can't find, right? And that is something inside of you. And, and that's exactly where I say, we were speaking about early on, that's the spiritual leg. So whatever that is, and it's not religious. Everyone knows I'm not religious. I'm non-denominational. I respect everything as long as it's coming from a place of love. But I'm saying that, when we then go back to discovering the love of God, the love of our Creator, the love that never, ever, ever stops loving me, just adoring me, just the mere fact that I'm alive means that I am adored and loved. But it's a place we get to as we do the spiritual work more and more, because it's so non-tangible, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not, so and I know traditional religion is more tangible because you're working with the Bible, you're working with books, you're working with people. It's a community. The spiritual journey is something that is often a lot more. You'll do it when it's a journey you do on your own very often, So it's a beautiful time for awakening either way, for all of us just to look at ourselves, realize, oh, there's something not firing quite as well as what I
Right.
wanted it to. So let me just check in with myself. Let's just check in. And that's it. We're going to figure things out. Speak to a friend or someone who you're close to and say, listen, do you think something could be amiss? Someone you trust, this is how we start doing it. But anyway, yes, we have just reached our time, but I would love to just ask you, Sara, and both Alice, if there's anything either of you would like to say before we bid each other farewell for today.
I would love if Sara could just give 2 or 3 steps or concepts that if you are feeling suicidal, if you are feeling worthless, if you are feeling just completely out of it, where do you go, Sara? What would you say? I know what I would say, but you as a clinical therapist, what would you
I think
say?
it depends on, I guess, perhaps the level of, like, where that level of the urge to actually take yourself out is. Like, if it is to the point like you cannot think about anything else, then that's when it's time to go to your local emergency room. It is time to get those supports in that can help keep you safe. And here, an involuntary hospitalization is not always the way. But if you were to that point where the steps to end your life are imminent, then that's what it's for. But if not, it's just, okay, I want to die, but you know what? I'll do it tomorrow. I'll do it tomorrow. I'll do it tomorrow, and keep building so many more tomorrows in that eventually you're like, oh, hey, it's been 2 years and I can't believe like I felt like that tomorrow because now, or yesterday, because now life is so different. So just kind of
Great tactic. Great
just
tactic.
knowing for someone who's there, just know you're not alone. As cheesy as that sounds, it's true. We're unique, but we're not unique in the disease and dysfunction of what goes on in the mind. Sometimes, like, we're not unique to that. There's somebody else who is also going through, and they'll understand. You just have to reach out, and that's the hardest thing that you'll ever do, is to reach out and ask for help.
I'm so glad you called me that night.
Me too.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, we need to be open. We need to be on the journey together. What is it you say, Chantelle? We're all just walking each other home, That's it.
Indeed we are. So, wow, everybody, thank you so much. So, Sara, thank you. Really, really great chatting with you and having you join us today. Very interesting. And I know that obviously with the situations you work with, it can be quite challenging sometimes. So I wish you well with that. And thank you again for joining us. Alice, thank you again for being here today as well. And thank you so much to all our viewers for joining us on our podcast today, where we really, these are such important topics to be talking about. So I want to ask you just to share this conversation, share this with people that you know. It's definitely, mental health, suicide, all of these things that create this. Everything just feeds into the other, really. At the end of the day, if we're looking at domestic violence, if we're looking at the economy right now, people not making ends meet, everything is just, so emotions are running sky high. And you know what? And the ones that often are suffering are the children and the animals, the worst. So let's be there for each other. If you hear something, see something, guys, we really should learn to step in and help where someone or something is suffering under the hands of another. So on that note,
look in the eyes of somebody.
Yeah, indeed. On that note, I wish you a beautiful rest of your Tuesday. It's almost good night here for us. I don't even got load shedding today. I've no load shedding today. I'm like, hallelujah! It's a miracle!
It is.
No load shedding. It'll probably come tonight when I'm least expecting it. Anyway, guys, take it easy, and we will see you tomorrow with Jessie. Okay. God bless everyone. Like, share, subscribe, and we'll catch you next time.